Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sascha Fahrbach. President Trump says Ukraine has shown zero gratitude, even as Washington pushes Kyiv to accept a 28-point peace plan requiring territorial concessions, a capped military, and a ban on NATO membership. But Secretary of State Marco Rubio struck a more optimistic tone after the first day, calling the Geneva talks the most productive and meaningful yet, stressing that the proposal is still evolving. Europe, meanwhile, is advancing a softer counterproposal that challenges key U.S. demands. Now, to discuss the plans and how it could play out, we're joined by Scott Lucas, Professor of American Studies, University College Dublin. Good to have you back on TVP World.
Thanks very much for having me.
There's progress all over. Rubio has said that they're moving forward. Trump has echoed this as well last night. So looking at this now, what's in play here is the European counterproposal, Scott. So tell us a little bit how this changes the optics, because Rubio kind of dismissed that almost at that press conference on Sunday. So what do you make of this European counterproposal? Does it have legs? Will it be listened to?
Not only does this European counterproposal have legs, it may have regained the diplomatic initiative from the Kremlin and the Kremlin's allies in the Trump administration. I need to explain that context a bit. If we had been talking going into the Geneva talks yesterday, we would have been talking about a 28-point proposal that originated with the Kremlin in the spring, that was effectively brought to the table in late October in discussions between Vladimir Putin's chief economic advisor, Kirill Dmitriev, with Donald Trump's envoy, the real estate developer Steve Witkoff, in Miami, Florida at the end of October. That Kremlin proposal, which in effect was backed by not only Witkoff, but Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and I suspect the Vice President, J.D. Vance, was the one that was going to look like an ultimatum as it was presented to Ukraine and Europe, because it effectively said, you give up the rest of the Donetsk region in eastern Ukraine to the Russians, even though Ukraine has 22% of it, and even though that is a very important strategic area, that Ukraine have its military force to 600,000 troops, that Ukraine can never join NATO, that sanctions are eventually lifted on Russia, and that the U.S. gets 50% of the so-called profits from Russian funds used in Ukraine's reconstruction. But what happened just before Geneva was that U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio pushed back against those voices in the Trump administration working with the Kremlin. He told U.S. legislators that this was a Russian plan. He told the legislators that this plan had been leaked to the media to try to publicize it, spread it as the only plan. And the U.S. legislators revealed that in a conference, security conference in Canada on Saturday. That meant there was the space for Ukraine and Europe to go in on Sunday, including in talks with the American delegation, which included Rubio and Steve Witkoff, and to present this counterproposal. The counterproposal has key differences. First of all, it goes with a ceasefire before you negotiate terms. The Kremlin Trump proposal was that you only have a ceasefire after Russia's terms are accepted. Secondly, that ceasefire is on the basis of the front lines. Russia does not get all of Donetsk. Third, Ukraine's path to NATO is not ruled out, although there is no consensus on this at this point. And fourth, funds for the reconstruction of Ukraine from frozen Russian assets are solely for Ukraine. They are not for U.S. profits.
Mm-hmm. I mean, interesting point you said there, very much about, you said, the territorial integrity of Ukraine. I mean, there, as you said, this is going to be something very difficult, I think, in either case for the Ukrainians to stomach. Also with security guarantees, which in effect, if you look at both of the plans, sort of almost sound like an Article 5 sort of guarantee for Ukraine. Do you think that the Russians, even if this was in discussion or this will be now changed slightly by the European plan, will the Russians accept such a condition in the plans?
No, and I need to make a key revision here. That is the Kremlin plan, which was pushed by Steve Witkoff, does not have what we call a NATO-like security guarantee. The so-called security guarantee is very vague. what there are explicit terms where it says no foreign troops in Ukraine. Second, that there are limits on Western military assistance to Ukraine. Now, it does have the provision, without consulting Poland, by the way, that European jet fighters can be positioned in Poland. But beyond that, there is no what we would call rigorous security guarantee for Ukraine if there was another Russian invasion. The Europe-Ukraine plan, by saying, look, we have a ceasefire first, then we are going to discuss these security guarantees, is, although we're not there yet, is much more of a potential assurance for Kyiv than what the Kremlin was offering.
Mm-hmm. And also, I think what's interesting here, and also kind of that sticks out, is that both plans do, I mean, the counterproposal and the original 28-point plan, they talk about amnesty pretty much across the board for Russian war crimes. I mean, how much does this surprise you? I mean, this is something very much the Europeans in particular have been strongly urging that there be accountability, but now it's in that counterproposal, including also the economic plans, a slow reintegration of Russia into the G8, case-by-case basis, those are the words. I mean, how much, let's say, of a betrayal is this? Do you see this as geopolitics? What do you make of those two issues?
Remember, at the highest level, no one can declare an all-out amnesty over war crimes, because the International Criminal Court, which has jurisdiction here, has issued warrants over purported war crimes, including against Vladimir Putin and his Children's Rights Commissioner, Maria Lvova-Belova. So, you know, the Europeans are going to make reference to amnesty, I think, for this basic reason, and that is, at the end of the day, and unfortunately we have to be realistic here, it's only losers who stand trial for war crimes. And I think the Ukraine-Europe plan does not set out that Russia has lost this. Russia will still occupy part of Ukraine for the foreseeable future. Russia will still, as it were, exist in its current form. There will be no, as it were, widespread economic pressure to try to collapse Russia. So you can't get that accountability you want for the highest officials like Vladimir Putin. Unfortunately, I think that is going to have to be accepted, with the priority being to get a ceasefire on the existing front lines. Mm-hmm.
And what about the sanctions relief? That's also something I think that sticks out, that also the European counterproposal includes. I mean, the wording is very delicate about it, but it does mean that Russia would be reintegrated in many, many ways economically in the global economic system. That may, I think, definitely surprise some people, especially the Ukrainians.
Well, I think the key here is that even the Kremlin proposal knew that to call for immediate sanctions relief was too much. So it uses that word gradual. And I think the Europeans and Ukraine have built upon that. And that is, Russia's going to have to pass a series of tests for those sanctions to be lifted. Mm-hmm. Russia is going to have to accept the ceasefire on the existing front lines. Mm-hmm. It is going to have to give assurances that it will not renew the invasion. It will have to accept monitoring that they will not renew that invasion. So I think the Russians are going to have to jump a series of hurdles before sanctions are lifted. Again, I don't think it's satisfactory that Russia ever comes back into the G8 while Vladimir Putin is still the leader. But realistically, if this ends the Russian invasion, and if this gives us reliable assurances that the Russians cannot attack again, it may be the price that you have to pay.
All right. And look, we're in day 2 now of this. I mean, as I said earlier, Marco Rubio said there's progress being made. Mercurial Trump in the mix as well, of course. But looking at who's on the ground, I'm curious to get your opinion here, because we have Marco Rubio, who you've already alluded to as someone who's really been trying to push this. I mean, J.D. Vance seems to have put the rocket under this idea to put it in faster at this point in time. There's Kellogg, Witkoff involved. How much of, let's say, rivalries and different opinions on the U.S. side are at this delegation? How much progress are we going to see today?
Okay, well, first of all, Keith Kellogg, the longtime U.S. envoy to Ukraine, and someone who had tried to back Ukraine against Russia's invasion, he's sidelined. Whether he is resigning of his own accord or being forced out, he's gone in January. So the camp's line is this, that you have a camp which, at the end of October, effectively hijacked the U.S. line, because the U.S. line at that point was to freeze the front lines. That camp was Steve Witkoff, the real estate developer, It was Jared Kushner, Donald Trump's son-in-law, and they were supported by J.D. Vance. The pushback against that, because Kellogg was sidelined, had to come from Marco Rubio, and it had to come from a lot of officials you will not hear about. There will be officials within the State Department, within the intelligence services, and within the military that do not like this capitulation to the Kremlin. So they've provided the working level support that underpins Rubio's maneuver. But I think here's a key player that almost no one has noticed, and that is the U.S. Congress. Because of what Congress saw as a betrayal of Ukraine, that's why you had them go very, very public with Rubio's lines, even if Rubio later denied them, that this was a Russian plan. And in the last 24 hours, congressmen, Republicans and Democrats have made clear that if Russia does not agree, does not negotiate on the terms set out in the Ukraine-Europe counterplan, then there will have to be more sanctions on Moscow, toughened sanctions on Moscow. Will we see the Republicans stand up to Donald Trump and J.D. Vance? We still have to wait and see, but it is now a possibility that Rubio will have an alliance with the U.S. Congress that will push back Witkoff, Kushner, and Vance.
Okay. And speaking of the U.S. as well, I mean, the reports right now that U.S. officials, Ukrainian officials are talking about a trip of President Zelensky going to Washington, maybe even as soon as this week. What does that, if anything, tell us? What can we expect if that trip does go ahead?
Oh, this is the cycle that we've seen since the spring. When the United States, or when the Trump administration cut off intelligence sharing, cut off military aid in the spring, you had a series of visits by European leaders following the disastrous Zelensky visit in the White House to repair the situation. In the summer, when there was an opening because Vladimir Putin overstepped the mark with the mass attacks killing Ukrainian civilians and the refusal to give up his territorial ambitions, then you had Zelensky and the Europeans going to Washington immediately after the Putin-Trump summit in Alaska in August. And in October, although it didn't go that well, you saw Zelensky going again to the White House to try to push back on Putin's attempts to spin Trump. Here we are again with yet another round, with the Kremlin's most ambitious attempt yet to present its plan as an American plan, to, as it were, whitewash it, to get it out across the media, and to try to impose it as an ultimatum on Ukraine. Europe and Zelensky have the space to go back in and to lobby Trump face-to-face and to try to reopen, or in fact take the high ground in terms of the political and diplomatic situation.
And of course, we have in all of that deadline, that Thursday deadline, and I have a feeling we're going to be talking about that much more these next coming days. Scott Lucas, thank you so much. Always a pleasure speaking to you.
Thanks to you, and thanks to all your great viewers.
And thank you for watching. That concludes World Talks, but there's much more here on TVP World, so don't go away. Goodbye.